General Hospital spoilers reveal that Britt had always believed. She understood pressure, medical pressure, moral pressure. The pressure of living under a clock she could not escape because of a disease. That slowly ate away at the body from the inside out. She had lived with guilt, with secrets, with mistakes she could not undo. But nothing in her chaotic past compared to the suffocating, calculated pressure now closing around her. As Brennan began revealing the true shape of his intentions, he had always been dangerous to anyone who rose high enough in the WSB carried shadows. But Britt had misjudged the depth of his ambition and the precision of his cruelty. When he promised to help her restore her medical license, she had been desperate, weakened by fear and exhaustion. Her judgment clouded by the terror of losing control over her illness. Brennan stepped into that vulnerability like a scalpel slipping into soft tissue silently, expertly, and with full awareness that once he had her trust, he would also have her obedience. And now, with that debt hanging above her like a noose, Brennan was tightening the rope. He wasn't a man who collected favors for satisfaction, he was a man who built empires with them. And Britt was beginning to understand, with nauseating clarity, that she had become an unwilling cornerstone in a plan far larger, far deadlier, and far more unpredictable than anything she imagined. The shift came gradually at first, subtle enough that someone less attuned to danger might have missed it. A comment here, a pointed question there, an offhand remark about Portia's influence at the hospital, or Sidwell's increasing unpredictability. Brennan's tone always carried a softness that contrasted too sharply with the brutality behind his words. Britt recognized the technique instantly. It was the same soft cruelty she'd seen in criminals just before they committed unspeakable acts. Brennan didn't threaten her outright. He merely painted pictures. He talked about Portia's inconsistent decision-making, about how patients suffer under weak leadership, about how the hospital needs someone willing to expose incompetence before lives are lost. Each phrase was a brushstroke, subtle enough to be dismissed, but heavy enough to linger long after he left the room. But then the brushstrokes began forming an unmistakable image. Brennan didn't simply want Portia removed from her position, he wanted her ruined, destroyed, eliminated as a force in Port Charles. And Britt, trapped between her need for the Huntington medication and Brennan's manipulated timing, felt the invisible chains tightening around her wrists. But Portia was only half the equation. The far more terrifying truth emerged slowly, like a monster rising from murky water. Unavoidable and monstrous, Brennan wanted to destroy Sidwell. Completely, irreversibly, spectacularly. Britt nearly froze when she realized it. Sidwell was not merely dangerous, he was lethal. He operated outside any ethical boundary, any legal constraint. She had witnessed him murder Dalton with a calmness that should never exist in a human being. She had felt his cold breath behind her when he reminded her that without his medicine, she would deteriorate into a miserable, agonizing death. Britt lived under Sidwell's control with a terror so deep it had become a part of her identity. And yet Brennan wanted her to stand between them not as a victim, but as a weapon. He wanted her to provoke Sidwell, manipulate him, sabotage him. He wanted her to dismantle the only man who held absolute control over her survival. Brennan believed that if Britt could turn Sidwell's empire to ash, then the entire city would follow, falling neatly into whatever new world order he envisioned. And the worst part was that Britt understood exactly why Brennan chose her. It wasn't just because he controlled the fate of her medical career. It wasn't just because he recognized her desperation. It wasn't just because he sensed the fear she carried every moment of every day. It was because Britt existed perfectly in the crossfire between Portia and Sidwell. Portia trusted her enough to let her into the hospital's inner workings. Sidwell relied on her enough to keep her close. Both sides overlooked her because they saw her as broken, scared, compromised. Brennan, however, saw her potential. To him, Britt wasn't weak, she was invisible. And invisibility, in Brennan's world, was a weapon stronger than any gun. The psychological devastation began before Britt even realized the destruction had started. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't breathe deeply without feeling a cold weight pressing into her lungs. She found herself startled by small sounds, glancing over her shoulder, waiting for either Sidwell to snap or Brennan to appear with another suggestion. Her illness, usually held in check by the medication, felt like it was simmering beneath the surface, threatening to break through at the worst possible moment. Brennan noticed a tremor in her hand one afternoon but said nothing. He didn't have to. The gleam in his eyes told her everything. He saw her weakness, and he would capitalize on it at the precise moment it served him. Poor Charles remained oblivious to the growing tension, but under the surface, the city was already shifting. Portia sensed danger but didn't know its source, leaving her irritable, defensive, and more vulnerable to manipulation. Sidwell sensed rebellion in the air, and with paranoia coiling tighter around him, he became increasingly volatile. His instructions to Britt grew more aggressive, more urgent, as though he sensed an invisible hand tightening around his empire. Meanwhile, Brennan watched the collapse like a man observing a chessboard, calculating each move with chilling patience. And at the center of the board stood Britt, shaking, terrified, and fully aware that a single mistake would lead to her ruin or her death. The real horror, however, came when Brennan revealed the final part of his plan. Not only was Britt expected to play both sides, she was expected to survive them. Brennan believed that if Britt could betray Sidwell without dying, and undermine Portia without detection, she would be the perfect agent, fearless, loyal, efficient. It was madness. Absolute madness. Britt knew there was no world where both Sidwell and Portia survived Brennan's plan. They were pieces meant for removal. And once those pieces fell, Brennan would have no more use for her. He would discard her. Perhaps silence her. Perhaps worse. But despite knowing that, Britt found herself trapped in a psychological box she could not escape. She needed the medication. She needed distance from Sidwell. She needed protection. She needed answers. And Brennan offered all of those things, but only if she obeyed. So she played along. She asked the questions Brennan wanted her to ask. She delivered the messages he wanted her to deliver. She lied when she needed to. She stayed silent when it was safer. But every act of compliance chipped away at her soul. Every timid nod felt like digging her own grave with her bare hands. And yet the true catastrophe had only begun to take shape. Because the moment Britt became Brennan's tool, a chain reaction ignited in every corner of Port Charles. Portia began to sense betrayal where none had existed before. Sidwell began to suspect rebellion and began tightening control over every facet of Britt's life. Jason, watching from the sidelines, realized something was horribly wrong, but Britt refused his help, afraid that accepting it would trigger Brennan's wrath or Sidwell's suspicion. Even the hospital staff noticed Britt's demeanor shifting, her posture tightening, her speech growing careful, her eyes losing the fire she once carried. Port Charles was becoming a powder keg, and Britt was walking around holding a lit match. The shock truly set in the moment Britt realized Brennan wasn't simply trying to eliminate Sidwell and Portia separately. He wanted them to collide. He wanted them to destroy each other. He wanted Britt to push Sidwell into targeting Portia and provoke Portia into exposing Sidwell. And when the two forces clashed, Brennan would sweep in and claim the remains of their destruction. It was genius in its cruelty and monstrous in its execution. And Britt, sick, scared, and trapped, was the one who would ignite the conflict. She could already see the devastation on the horizon. The destruction of Portia's career. The collapse of Sidwell's empire. The implosion of whatever fragile safety she still possessed. Brennan's plan wasn't just a threat, it was a catastrophe waiting to unfold. And Britt was the catalyst. She didn't know how to escape. She didn't know who to trust. She didn't know how many days she had left before either Brennan or Sidwell or both decided. She had outlived her usefulness. All she knew was this: the disaster had already begun. And she was standing in its center. With no way out, no guarantee she would survive the storm she had been forced to unleash. Britt had always believed she could survive anything if she simply kept her head down and her secrets locked away. But the pressure closing around her now was unlike anything she had ever endured. Brennan tightening his grip, Sidwell watching her every breath. The hospital shifting like a battlefield beneath her feet. Every force in her life was squeezing her, until she felt her bones might crack under the weight. Each day she woke praying for a moment of peace, but peace never came. Instead, the tension grew sharper, heavier, darker, until Britt's mind began to fracture along lines she could no longer control. The illusions she had used to protect herself, denial, silence, obedience, were breaking apart, leaving her exposed and trembling. And in that unraveling, she realized she could no longer carry the burden alone. For the first time, Britt found herself thinking of Jason not as a colleague, not as a fighter, but as the one person who might actually see through the darkness consuming her. She remembered how he had once looked at her, not with pity, but with clarity. Jason had always been able to cut straight through fear, through chaos, through guilt. He had always known when someone was drowning, even if they pretended they were swimming. Britt had pushed him away for months, too afraid of dragging him into Sidwell's madness, too aware that Brennan was watching for any sign of disloyalty. But now, with her sanity slipping through her fingers, she felt an instinct rising inside her, a desperate, primal need to confide in him before the darkness swallowed her whole. It began as a quiet whisper in the back of her mind, an echo she tried to ignore. Jason needs to know. Then the whisper became a pulse, then a drumbeat, then an obsession. Britt found herself replaying every moment Jason had offered help, every warning, every question, every word of concern she had brushed aside. She remembered the way he had looked at her when he asked about the medication Sidwell was forcing her to take. How his jaw tightened when she dodged his questions. How his eyes narrowed when he realized she was hiding something. At the time, she told herself she was protecting him. Now she realized she had been protecting herself from the truth he would force her to face. The truth that she was being used. The truth that she had become a weapon. The truth that Brennan wanted blood, and he wanted to spill it through her. The weight of those truths crushed her, and the more Brennan demanded, the more Sidwell tightened his control, the more the desperation inside Britt clawed for escape. She felt it building an emotional pressure so intense it threatened to burst from her chest. Like a scream she could no longer swallow. Britt was unraveling, and in her unraveling came a dark clarity. If she didn't tell Jason everything, she might die. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And not just her, Portia, Sidwell. Even Jason himself were being pulled into a vortex she had helped create without meaning to. So the thoughts began to twist. Maybe Jason could protect her. Maybe Jason could fix this. Maybe Jason could stop Brennan. Maybe Jason could destroy Sidwell before Sidwell destroyed her. The more she thought about it, the more the idea grew into a consuming obsession. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about truth. It was about ending the nightmare. It was about reclaiming control of her life. Even if doing so meant blowing up everything Brennan had built in the shadows. Britt knew telling Jason would ignite a war, but the war was already coming. And Jason was the only one capable of surviving it. What she didn't expect, however, was what Jason would become the moment he sensed the truth. Jason had been operating in the background, observing, waiting, analyzing. He had suspected for weeks that Britt was caught between forces far more dangerous than she was willing to admit. But hearing the full truth, hearing how Brennan was using her, how Sidwell was threatening her life, how both men saw her as a pawn awakened something inside Jason that had been buried for years. A fury. A cold, lethal clarity. A darkness he had spent years trying to restrain. Because it wasn't just Britt being targeted. It was the hospital. It was the WSB. It was the very foundation of Port Charles, the legacies built in blood, in betrayal, in secrets. Brennan wasn't just manipulating Britt. He was attempting to reshape the entire power structure of the city. And Jason recognized the pattern immediately. He had seen men like Brennan before, men who believed they could play God. Who believed they could manipulate systems, institutions, families, lives, all without consequence. Men who believed they could control the future by destroying anyone tethered to the past. Jason had spent years trying to step back from that kind of war. But Britt's confession dragged him straight into the heart of it. Her shaking voice, her trembling hands, her terror, everything about her broke something inside him. Jason wasn't just angry for her. He was angry for every innocent life caught in Brennan's carefully woven trap. He was angry for every threat Sidwell had made. He was angry for the way the powerful used the vulnerable as chess pieces. And once that anger ignited, it didn't burn hot, it burned cold. Controlled. Sharp. Lethal. A new darkness settled inside him, an obsession of his own. Not to protect Britt. Not to save Portia. Not even to dismantle Sidwell's reign of terror. Jason wanted to dismantle the entire framework Brennan was trying to build. He wanted to tear down the legacies of corruption stretching from the WSB to the shadows Sidwell operated in. He wanted to destroy the machine that allowed men like Brennan to exist at all. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't justice. It was correction, of violent, necessary correction to a system that had spiraled too far out of control. When Britt confessed, she expected Jason to react with concern or fear. Instead, she watched a transformation, quiet, controlled, terrifying. His eyes hardened. His voice dropped. His posture straightened with purpose. Jason wasn't afraid. He wasn't confused. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was ready. Ready to strike. Ready to burn down the empire Brennan had built inside the shadows. Ready to take on Sidwell even if it meant going to war alone. Ready to protect Britt with a level of determination she wasn't sure she deserved. And that was the real shock the moment Britt realized the truth she had spent months running from. Jason was no longer simply reacting to the chaos around him. He was stepping into the darkness willingly, intentionally, methodically. Her confession hadn't broken him. It had awakened him. The distant QSA about LCC. Baimet Vakayan LCC Hangchuri Diva. Jason was prepared to destroy it before it consumed the city. He had tried so desperately to shield. Britt had unleashed something. Something powerful. Something unstoppable. Something darker than she expected. And now, for the first time since Brennan began tightening his grip, Britt felt hope. Not because the danger was gone, far from it. But because Jason was now standing between her and the abyss. And if Brennan wanted a war, Jason was going to give him one. A war that would become the next great shockwave in Port Charles. A war no one, not Portia, not Sidwell, not the WSB was prepared for. And everything that followed would begin with one terrified whisper. Jason, I need to tell you the truth. Jason had spent months watching Britt unravel under pressure she refused to explain. Studying the tremors in her hands, the shadows beneath her eyes. The moments her confidence flickered like a candle threatened by wind. But he had also seen something else, something Britt herself couldn't recognize anymore. A strength buried under the fear. A resilience choked by manipulation. A brilliance overshadowed by what Brennan and Sidwell had done to her. Jason, with his quiet instincts and razor-sharp attention, began to see the one thing everyone else had missed. Britt's greatest weakness was also her greatest strength. She knew Brennan's patterns. She understood Sidwell's operations from the inside. She had the medical knowledge and strategic mind to expose everything they had built. But months of terror had made her forget that she was capable of fighting back. Jason didn't forget. And once Britt finally confessed what Brennan had been forcing her into, it didn't break Jason. It activated him. In the days that followed her confession, Jason did what he always did. He observed first. Britt expected him to rush into action, to storm into Brennan's office or confront Sidwell with a gun drawn. But Jason remained unnervingly calm. He sat in silence, letting Britt speak, letting her collapse, letting her fear pour out until every detail was laid bare. And with each detail, Jason didn't see a helpless woman. He saw a weapon Brennan had underestimated. He saw someone who had survived Sidwell's cruelty, navigated his insanity, learned to anticipate his moves. He saw someone who had been trained psychologically against her will to understand exactly how monsters operate. And Jason recognized the pattern because he had been shaped by violence, by manipulation, by men who believed they could bend the world with threats and shadows. For Jason, everything clicked at once. Britt's strength wasn't in her defiance. It was in her survival. And that made her more valuable than Brennan ever realized. But Jason also knew something else. Britt wasn't the only target. Once Brennan gained control over her, he would push deeper into Port Charles. He would destabilize the hospital, pick apart Sonny's network, dismantle Laura's political influence, and draw Carly into the fallout whether she liked it or not. Brennan wasn't planning a simple takeover. He was constructing an empire in the shadows, using emotional blackmail, medical corruption, and strategic violence as building blocks. And Britt was just step one. Jason refused to let that happen. For the first time in years, Jason felt something waking inside him, a clarity. A purpose sharpened by rage, by instinct, by loyalty. Not just loyalty to Britt, but to Carly, to Sonny, to Laura, to the city he had protected for decades. Brennan had touched the wrong person. Brennan had threatened the wrong woman. And Jason was done watching from the sidelines. Behind the scenes, Jason began collecting information quietly, strategically, methodically. He studied hospital access logs, traced unusual WSB communication pings, monitored shipments arriving through the Port Charles docks, and observed Sidwell's men as they moved through the city. And with each layer he peeled back, Jason felt the shape of the threat expanding. Brennan wasn't just controlling Britt. He was preparing for something larger. Something that required tearing down Portia's authority, manipulating medical protocols, and using Sidwell's hidden biochemical research to build a weaponized network. Only the WSB could understand. Jason realized that if Brennan succeeded, Port Charles would become collateral damage. But where others saw an unstoppable adversary, Jason saw cracks forming. And every crack pointed back to Britt. She held pieces of information no one else did. She had access to Sidwell's operations. She had witnessed experiments, seen formulas, heard conversations, read encrypted notes Brennan thought she wouldn't understand. Even her fear had value because it had forced her to pay attention to details no one else would notice. Jason approached her gently at first, knowing she was teetering on the edge of emotional collapse. He didn't demand anything. He didn't threaten. He simply asked her to trust him, something no one had asked her in months. And as Britt looked into his eyes, she saw the thing she had forgotten existed in her world. Someone who believed her. Not someone who wanted to use her. Not someone who wanted to control her. Someone who simply wanted her safe. That belief broke something open inside Britt. The fear began to loosen. The shame began to ease. The strength she had buried resurfaced like something pulled from deep water. Gasping for air but very much alive. Jason helped her reclaim it. He trained her not with weapons, but with awareness. He taught her how to observe without reacting, how to hide fear behind strategy, how to communicate silently through glances or signals. He taught her how to gather evidence without leaving fingerprints, how to spot surveillance patterns, how to breathe steadily under pressure. And slowly, as days passed, Britt began to feel herself changing. The tremors grew lighter, the panic attacks shorter. She began to sleep again, not fully, but enough to think clearly, enough to fight. Jason had found her strength. Now he intended to weaponize it against Brennan. Because Brennan wasn't only a threat to Britt, he was a threat to everything Jason held sacred. Carly was already on Brennan's radar because of her sway over the hospital, and her connection to Jason. Sonny was marked because Brennan understood that any real control over Port Charles required dismantling Sonny's network. Laura was next because her political influence could block any expansion Brennan had planned. The more Jason uncovered, the more he realized Brennan intended to topple the city piece by piece. Jason refused to let his world fall. His loyalty to Carly was unshakable. His bond with Sunny was ironclad. His respect for Laura was rooted in years of fighting alongside her against threats. Not unlike this one. But this time, the war would be different. This time, the catalyst was Britt, and the danger was more personal than anything Jason had faced in years. For the first time, Jason's instinct for protection linked all four of them together. Brennan was moving against them as a group even if they didn't see it yet. Jason saw it. And now he was preparing for the explosion that was coming. The adjustment sweeping through Port Charles wasn't just a shift in alliances or a political shakeup, it was the beginning of a war for control of the city's soul. Jason could feel it in every step he took, every conversation he overheard, every clue Britt provided from her months inside Brennan's and Sidwell's orbit. Port Charles was standing on the edge of a knife, and only Jason understood how deep the cut would go if Brennan wasn't stopped. He knew the moment was coming when he would have to strike. A moment when protecting Britt, Carly, Sunny, and Laura would require him to step back into the shadow world he had tried to leave behind. A moment when he would have to forget restraint and remember exactly who he used to be. The man without fear. The man who did what needed to be done. The man who protected his people with silence, precision, and unquestioned loyalty. Jason's transformation didn't frighten him. It frightened everyone who had ever stood against him. Britt sensed it to the shift inside him, the storm building behind his calm expression. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not because the danger was leaving, but because Jason was stepping into it. If Brennan wanted a war, he would get one. If Sidwell wanted control, he would lose it. If Port Charles was about to fall apart, Jason would hold it together with force. And Britt, broken, terrified, but rising again, would no longer be a pawn. She would be the spark, the proof, the weapon Brennan never expected. This wasn't just a shift. It was a reckoning. And Jason was ready to deliver it.